Nikki, welcome to the studio. And you've got a lovely array of things here. Thank
I always
you very
like.
much. Yes, we do like food at the Student Hub Live. Now, why are we going to be looking at essay writing and hamburgers?
Well, because an essay is very like a hamburger, in case you haven't noticed. There are layers to every essay. And the simple layers are an introduction and the middle section and the conclusion. But within all those, there's further layers. So we're hoping to show students how you can build your burger essay.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Now, we know from previous experience that our students at the Student Hub Live love highlighting, and they love colour-coding highlighting, and they'll often highlight their essays. So they seem to like the visual stuff, and I guess this is quite a visual thing too. I mean, students probably won't want to literally draw hamburgers around their essays, but how can these visual ideas sort of help people get the right balance between the things going on?
Well, I think if you can picture something, you're almost there.
Yeah.
So it works the same as a diagram. And we have our little flags and things which we'll be using for the layers. So again, they work in a literal sense. And it might be helpful to draw something like a burger. Sometimes it helps you to plan out when you have something visual to link onto.
Yeah, because as Georgina and Matt were saying before, you can't, with an end of module assessment, because it's more holistic, and we're talking about essay writing very generally here, but also when you are doing one of these examinable components, and you've got to be a bit more holistic, you can't just lift things that you've done before. You can't just get all of the evidence and compile it all together and say, look at how much I can fit into here really clearly and succinctly, because there has to be some structuring going on. And some students were saying before that they were having trouble planning. And I was saying to Matt and Georgina, well, I'm not sure whether it's because sometimes we think the plan should look really beautiful and be a certain way, or sometimes maybe it's because they're planning based on evidence and they aren't maybe thinking about these aspects, the evaluation or defining the terms or all the other things that you need to effectively put into a plan for an essay.
Yes, and I think what you need to think about is your end of module assessment, your assignment or whether you're doing an exam, is your shop window. Yeah. So you're really showing what you've learnt on that module and your deep understanding. And to do that, you need to evaluate, you need to contextualise, you need all the things that come into a good essay.
Brilliant. Now, we've got a whole list of questions. So if you're in the Watch and Engage, you should see some lovely, bright, colourful widgets. A lot of these are multi-choice questions, so you can tell us the answer that most applies to you. So have a go at those. And what we're going to do is feed your answers in. But of course, if there are questions, put those in the chat. And for those of you who are watching in the live stream only, if you'd like to come in, then please do come into the Watch and Engage. And if you don't have an Open University computer username, you can get one. They're free and easy to get hold of. So see the frequently asked questions section on the website for how to do that. You can also, of course, email us, studenthub@open.ac.uk, and we're also keeping an eye on Twitter, and the hashtag for that is StudentHubLive16. So do let us know if you've got any questions and also how you do things, because as we've seen from this earlier session, you've got some great advice as well about how to do things, because of course you are the experts at doing all of this. So, Nikki, we thought we've got an hour, OK? We've got a nice amount of time here to talk about essay writing. So we were arguing about how to proportion this time and how we would best communicate this with our students. So tell us why we've decided to structure this with the very beginning, which you and I disagree with.
We do. Well, I think we should structure it by starting with the introduction to the essay and to this session. But you disagree with me, I know.
I do, yes.
When I write an essay, I do always write an introduction first. And the reason for this, and I know you're going to argue with me, the reason is I like to know what I'm going to do. I like to sort of have a thought and be aiming somewhere. And I do it all the time. But I was thinking very carefully, because I'm actually working on a PhD at the moment, and I was writing the introduction to it a few weeks ago, and I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, I write the introduction knowing I'm going to come back and rewrite it. So perhaps there's something in your argument there.
Well, let's call it a starting point.
Yeah.
Do you write your introduction first or last or somewhere in the middle? So let us know how you go about this essay writing process and if you've got a strong opinion about it. I guess what we do agree on is that it is important to know vaguely what you're going to write about before you start writing it.
Yes.
And so, you know, that this whole idea of planning an essay is important. Yeah. If we were to think about planning and these flags that we've got going on here, what might go into this plan, and then how could you sort of use that to, irrespective of whether you were writing or rewriting the introduction first or last, how could you then start to structure your argument so that you were thinking about what bits you might include?
Okay, so here we have our introduction.
Okay, good.
Now, what should we have as an introduction? Are we gonna?
Well, that should be the top of the burger.
Do you think that should be the top?
I think so.
Okay, so what do you want on the top? A tomato. Should we have a tomato on the top?
Okay.
Okay, so mind you, this is going to be upside down burger. Okay, so there's our introduction. So we'll start with the tomato introduction. Okay, and next off, we have a choice. We have evaluation, we have linking sentences, we have evidence, wherever it is, evidence. Oh, it's dropped a bit. We have context. We have what else? Independent learning. And I think somewhere in here we need to have a point.
We do.
If I can find it.
Nikki, what is a point?
A point is an argument. So we're making, basically an essay is an argument or a series of arguments. So you introduce it by saying, my argument for writing this essay is that I would like to impart my knowledge on writing essays to students. So that would be my opening statement for and then I have to make a point. What's the first point I would make in this essay? What's the first thing? So you've already done a session on good planning. Good planning is essential. And then I would have to contextualise this, which would be to give some evidence. Why is good planning essential? Okay. Then I would have to provide some context for it. And I would have to evaluate each point that I make. So each argument I make has to be proved, in other words. And there's several ways of proving it with these flags.
Good, okay. Well, let's see what everyone thinks is a point. I mean, it's one of these things that is very easy when you're having an argument with a 7-year-old to say, my point is this, yes. But it's a very, very difficult thing to think about in the context of essay writing. So we've given you some choices, part of an argument to be supported or refuted by correctly referenced examples or quotations or evaluations, or what you're talking about and if other people agree, or a subtopic that you need to be proved with quotes from a module book. So let's have a look and see what you all said. 100% have gone for option A, part of an argument to be supported or refuted by correctly referenced examples. It does sound more sensible, Nikki, is it right?
It is, I think. That's exactly. So if we have our point, what should we have our point? Well,
I've got a diagram here. So if we wanted to, we could remember some of our bits. Otherwise, it can get very confusing doing things back to front.
It could.
But I think that meat. And sorry, this is we have vegetarian options as well, but that is definitely the evidence.
So there's the evidence.
Yeah.
If I can find the evidence flag, there's some evidence, and we have to evaluate our evidence.
Yes.
Is this evidence that you're giving actually relevant to the point that you've made?
Now, this is a very good point. Oh, dear. Because sometimes, depending on which level, you will be doing more or less evaluation, won't you, as you're going through an essay? So, but is evaluation always part of it? And is it part of every paragraph?
It is, really. And it's definitely part of every point that you make. And it will be different at different levels. So at level 1, you may, as your evidence, use a quotation from the module book or a paraphrasing something from the module, and you will evaluate it and say, and this is why this proves my point. At a higher level, you'll probably have been doing your own independent research, and you
Wikipedia.
With what?
Wikipedia.
No, we're not having Wikipedia at all. No.
While I'm on telling off, Stuart Geddes, stop telling Sophie to nip in and get a bit of our burgers. That's not going to happen. Sorry.
So no Wikipedia. You will have done your own independent research. We have a marvellous library here at the Open University. There's lots and lots of information on all subjects in there. But you will have researched your subject. But you've got to say why it's relevant. And whether you're at level 1 or at PhD level, there's got to be a reason for you choosing that piece of evidence. And once you've chosen it, you will evaluate it. So what did we have for our evaluation? Let's have a look. Cheese. A cheesy evaluation we have.
Cheese is a very complex and varied thing, isn't it? So I suppose it's only fitting.
It is, because at level 1, you probably have a piece of this kind of cheese. The flaccid...
or even the Emmental with holes in it.
Yes. Whereas you might go for your... ooh. Hang on, it won't stand up.
Chuck a few on.
Hang on,
We can
I'll
have a
stick
very-
it. We can use the burger as it should be, because
as the yes.
as the stodge
Centrepiece.
in the middle. But yes, you might have your Roquefort or something like that at PhD level, or you might have several different cheeses
Yeah.
to show that you can evaluate on different levels.
Yeah.
So our next thing we had was a bit of sauce.
Yes.
So a bit of sauce, which shall I splodge some?
Yeah, go on then. I think we'd all like to see some sauce.
Let's have a splodge of sauce. It's splodged on me.
Yes.
So there's a splodge of sauce. And that would be your linking sentences.
Yeah.
Because to write a good essay, which we'll talk about in a minute, it has to read well and
Yeah.
it has to flow nicely.
Yeah.
So you can't just write one paragraph about one thing and then go to something completely different on the next
Yeah.
paragraph.
Yeah.
You will link them together
Yeah.
and segue them. So we'll have a linking sentence, which is also a bit of sauce there.
Yeah.
And I'm covered in it now. And we've got evaluation, and we need a bit of independent learning.
Is that our lettuce
Yes,
or tomato?
I think that's the independent learning.
Yes.
So, and this is a bit a level specific thing. What we want all students to be is independent learners,
Yeah.
and we want to show that you can research yourselves
Yeah.
and do your own thing. The more of this that you can show that's relevant,
Yeah.
the higher your marks are going to be.
Yeah.
But at level 1, you probably won't be doing an awful lot of independent learning.
No.
You will probably be looking at your module materials, looking at what your tutors told you, at online activities, and be using those.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. And of course our buns, which hold it all together.
Yes. So this will be, and this is a bit like the beginning and the end.
Yes.
So it'll hold it all together in a nicely written paragraph.
Okay, so that's all well and good. So I can see now how when you're thinking about planning, a lot of students will really go for the evidence. So they'll be like, I'm going to use this example, I really like that bit there. And they get all of the meat together and then they sort of say, right, there's my plan and I have now got these examples that are around that I'm going to talk about and that's how I'm going to address the question. And then that's as far as the plan goes.
Well, only this morning I have been marking an essay and that looked like this.
Yes, yes, yes,
Which is edible.
yes, it is.
And it is an essay, but that's not really what we're looking for
No.
for an essay. So it was lacking these other elements to it.
Stefana's worried that if he doesn't like cheese, he's not going to be able to get a PhD.
No, I'm afraid not. There's lots of types of cheese, Stefan. Even if you're a vegan, there's even vegan cheese now.
It's metaphorical, I guess, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, but you are right, Nikki, because a lot of the time, and in particular where there is a broad, overarching question, students will want to showcase a lot of evidence.
They will.
might even, I mean, Georgina and Matt told us before that they should not do this. They might even go back to where they've written an essay and say, I talked about that, so I'm going to use that example. And they might then try and bring it into this. And so what then happens is that there's a lot of evidence that sort of, you can see how it might relate, but again, it's how it relates. So how might they start thinking about using some of these things to evaluate this evidence and think about what it means for the essay question, because that really is the independent learning. That is what you're being asked to do.
Yeah.
It's not, can you find some stuff?
Yeah.
It's, can you explain how, with some stuff you find, you can answer this question?
Yes, it's how you can show. Well, I mean, the question is always very important, of course, and keep referring back to the question. One of the problems that you get is lots of evidence that in the end doesn't even go back to the question at all. But once you have your evidence, and sometimes, and this is where my argument about doing the start first, the introduction first comes, is what do you want to say? How are you going to answer the question? Before you look at compiling tons of evidence, have a look, because you might have your context in your head already. So how are you going to prove? How do you make a good burger? There's a good essay.
Okay.
There's a good essay title. So how do you make a good burger? What do you need first?
Well, this is, I don't know, how would I answer this? I would probably put the burger, then the lettuce, then the, I don't know. Burger, cheese, lettuce, tomato.
So burger, a piece of cheese, a piece of lettuce, and a piece of tomato.
So would I then be saying, as an introduction, how to construct the perfect burger is a matter of opinion, and this is just my interpretation?
Well, it could be, because there are different ways of doing it. So you could start off with, as you've done there, your point, your evidence.
Yeah.
And then you can, I forgot what the cheese is. What was cheese? That was the evaluate. Then you can evaluate it.
Yeah.
And then your lettuce is your, then you can contextualise it.
Yeah.
And your tomato was...
Is our independent learning.
Independent
I think
learning.
we've moved a few of those around, but that's
Yeah.
fine. The point is, I guess, is that how you're combining these things means that they're not all being mixed up. So each thing is doing and contributing a different part of the whole process, isn't it?
Yes, and the evidence is in the middle of that part. So the evidence is important. But in order to show that you understand why that evidence is important, you have to have the other parts all in with it.
So when we're looking at, I guess, our range then of essays, because this is a paragraph, isn't it?
Yes.
In this whole thing. So each of our paragraphs is making a certain argument. And would you say that each one needs to be the same? Or could it be, for example, that in some paragraphs you might have 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, in one you're doing more of an evaluation? Do they all need to be the same as you're moving through the essay?
Not at all. And sometimes your evidence might prove and disprove a point.
Yes.
So you might have 2 arguments for the same point, and then you come down on one or the other by the end of the essay. So you could easily have, I mean, I could say that I think a good burger must have meat in it.
Yes.
And you say, well, I don't, because I'm a vegetarian. Now,
Yes.
both those arguments really need to come into it before you make your decision in the essay and make your overall argument in the essay.
Yes. Now, how might students then identify? We've talked about meat being evidence, and we've talked about, obviously, using a lot of examples at times in an essay not being such a good thing because it needs to be framed. But sometimes when maybe you are saying, well, I've outlined this argument and I've outlined this argument, and now I'm going to tell you what I think in this bit here. So you might have a very evaluative paragraph of an essay that maybe doesn't have as much evidence. But equally, it still needs to be progressing that argument, and it still needs to be drawing on something other than just someone's opinion. So how might one use evidence then as something that's more, I guess, lateral, other than just so-and-so did this study?
Well, you come into your own argument, you link your paragraph together, so you will link down into an argument that says that can go into your opinion. So you've got an argument, you've got your piece of evidence, and then you'll start to contextualise it. And you will contextualise it in different ways. And that's how your essay will start to flow into different types of paragraphs. And some of them will have completely different layers in. And some of them might miss out the source, for instance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what we're trying to do, I guess, is give students an analogy to think about the scope and the flavour and the mixture of things that they're putting into an essay. There always needs to be, irrespective of whatever level, there always needs to be some evidence that is held in within the essay. essay. But when planning, they need to consider the evaluation and the various aspects around all of that. So let's think practically then, Nikki, about how students might start thinking about that, because the evidence seems so very concrete at times. They've got the question, they've thought about how the question relates to what they're trying to do. But how do they then start? You said, how good is this piece of meat, or how good is this evidence in terms of evaluating something? Why is context important? It's not always important. Evaluation isn't always important. So how do students identify when they need to consider some of these other aspects to support the evidence?
Well, for instance, I've been marking essays recently with, using various sources, and they're about the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, which I think most people probably know something or other about. And we have various pieces of evidence about how poor people were treated, how the working classes were treated. And the evidence ranged from newspaper reports to things like Engels' book on the condition of the working classes in the 19th century, to Charles Dickens and Mary Gaskell's novels. And all of these are pieces of evidence that are all similarly important, but in a different way. And you could look at something like a Charles Dickens story set in the 19th century and look at the way the characters are treated, and he's put an awful lot of information in there in a different way to a newspaper report. But in the end, they're both telling us something about the 19th century, and they're both very relevant. What's not relevant is how factual Dickens is. If you wanted just hard facts, his isn't hard facts, his is fiction. But how fictional is a newspaper report? So you would be arguing on both courts, really.
And how might students then use that to structure their paragraph? Because if we can we've asked actually a question, we might see what students said. We've asked, what is a paragraph and how long is a paragraph? I've seen some paragraphs that are very long in a one sentence, which can be quite confusing to read.
Yes.
I've seen some that are literally half an A4 piece of paper as well. So tell us what you think a paragraph is. We've got a range of questions. It's about 6 sentences long, based on a single idea, contains at least one piece of evidence, and is a combination of pieces of evidence. So tell us which one you think most applies to the idea about what is a paragraph.
I mean, one thing I will say is, having taught for the OU for very many years, I can look at an essay without reading a word, and I can usually tell if it's going to be any good or not. And if I see on page 1 a chunk of dense text and no paragraphs, I know it's not going to be a great essay. Yeah. And similarly, if I see a paragraph without a single quotation in it, I know it's probably not going to be great, or it's all just paraphrased. You can tell, can't you?
Yes. Well, I wouldn't recommend putting quotations in all paragraphs, but you would if you were an art student. Yeah. Absolutely, then you'd need to. Right, let's see what people at home have said in terms of what they think a good paragraph is. 85% of them have said it's based on a single idea. Nobody says it's around 6 sentences. 9% contains at least one piece of evidence, and 6 is a combination of pieces of evidence. Now, I'm not sure which one I would have selected there, Nikki. Which is the right answer? Is there a right answer?
I don't think there is. I think there could be an element of truth.
There could be. But ultimately, I think the idea of things being around a single idea is really, really strong, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that can be quite hard to achieve, especially when you've got a lot going on. And this links us back to the idea of these points, you know. So what is the point that one is making? And how can that point be a single idea, even if maybe you're doing a couple of things in there? You're saying so-and-so found this and so-and-so found this, and they're both supporting that single point. Would you say it's a good defining thing to really focus on one idea per paragraph?
I think it is, yes. And you'll know when you're coming off the point and when you're going on to another one. And that point should lead to the next. So a single point, a burger should... a good beef burger should involve some bread.
Yeah.
And a patty of some description. I'm not going to go for meat or vegetarian. I think would be a fair enough piece of a fair enough point. But you might then you could also argue, yes, but it's always preferable to have some lettuce and a tomato as well.
Yes.
And that would just be an essay on writing burgers, Ron.
Yes, writing.
Yeah.
No, indeed. Do some students get confused between the distinction between a point and a piece of evidence?
I think they do. Yeah, I think they do, and they think they'll put down a piece of evidence as though it's making the point for them.
Yeah.
And it isn't. You still have to show that you understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
And a piece of evidence can almost look like a point at times.
Yeah. But sometimes you might get a theory or an idea that you think, oh, he's really famous, he's written loads of books, that has to be really sensible. And so I'm going to describe it all in detail and put it in there because it's a really good big theory. How do students then sort of think about the point in terms of something that can seem very uncontested, something they might not want to argue with if it's one of the big theorists' ideas, etc.? How do they then say, well, this is the point that this is making to my particular essay?
Well, I think they need to have a look when they are choosing their evidence is looking at the different arguments. There won't just be one answer to any essay. Yeah. And I think one of the things that you have to realise, even at level 1, is there's more than one answer. You're not just expected to go in one direction all the time. And have a look at a variety of evidence and a variety of points and try and include those in your essay without overloading everything. But you will come down on one side or another.
Yeah. What if it's not a sided question, though? Can you still, sometimes there's not a clear argument to have. It's like discuss this or compare and contrast. But ultimately, normally, you will be having some sort of view overall in terms of where you want to go with that. So how strongly can students assert that perspective?
They can assert it as strongly as they like, as long as they have the evidence and they contextualise it and they evaluate it. If you can tell, a student can argue me out of what I always thought about that topic, if it's a strong essay, and that's all the things that we're talking about in these burgers. If it flows from one paragraph to the next, you can change anybody's mind. That's what an argument is.
Yeah. So it's using the evidence to make the points that you want to be making in light of that question.
Yes.
HJ and Sophie, how's everything going on the hot desk?
There's a lot of food talk, as always. This hasn't really helped, so...
Yes. No.
In amongst that, we do have some serious bits, though.
Yes. No, I think Ben's got a good point. He says he kind of likes the burger analogy, but it poses a problem with assessing the burgeriness of any given burger. So how do tutors get from the burger menu whether it tastes good or not?
I think that's where we need to step in and proof eat.
You're not
the
allowed
burger
to come and steal the burgers, Sophie.
I've been so
after
good.
After the incident before with HJ, you know what happened and how upset I got.
So well. We did have a really good question actually from Richard. It was a little while ago. Apologies. But can you use sentences from your previous TMAs in your final EMA? Is that allowed?
Well, I asked Matt and Georgina this before because my students had been asking me and I said no, and I'm so glad Matt and Georgina said no.
Yeah.
But tell us why. I mean, what I've told my students in terms of that is that often beforehand you'll have been doing something completely different. You'll have been writing an essay, even though you might use that same example, you've been doing something different.
Yeah.
You've been maybe describing something or comparing and contrasting. So as soon as you lift something, you aren't addressing the question because often, like in an EMA, you're having to be a lot more holistic. You won't describe how they did it and what they did. You'll say, these guys found this and the point then is blah.
Yeah. Yes, and it feels shoehorned in.
Yeah.
It won't feel natural because that's one of the things with a good essay. It needs to be well written and flow.
Yeah.
And if you suddenly have this completely odd example in there with a chunk of text that doesn't directly reference to the question or your previous argument, then it's good to stick out like a sore thumb. So, yeah, I would say no.
Yeah. Yeah, and also effectively you are plagiarising your own work, which isn't a good idea at all. So it's lazy and it's not going to answer the question and it will look clumpy.
Yeah, and it can come up. It can come up on the plagiarism software, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yes, avoid that at all costs, I think.
Okay, Sophie and HA, any other sensible questions? Not that we don't like fun, but we do have a limited time to cover a lot.
Yes, I think one point that few of us have been discussing is about the use of language, and you brought it up, and some of us are struggling with getting used to writing in academic language and sort of trying to get rid of those colloquialisms we might use. What advice do you have for us about that, do you reckon?
Oh, that's such a good question.
It is, because there is a voice of an essay and it's a kind of passive voice. It's not you. You don't use I at all in an essay. And some students will start off beautifully and suddenly it's I think. And those are two words that nobody wants to read in an essay, as I think, but they do creep in an awful lot. And I totally understand it. I totally, because you get involved in your writing, you feel passionate about the subject, and yes, you do have your opinion.
Well, let's see what people said. We asked, what is the correct language to use in an essay? And there were 3 options this time: formal and concise, colloquial, or using long words and complicated sentences. Let's see what you thought. OK, well, everyone's got here the right answer, formal and concise. But is it better, Nikki, if you don't really know, say, what you're talking about? So say you want to shoehorn something in. Would it be better to use colloquial language and effectively write in your own words? Or would it be better to maybe just chuck in a massive quote or add in a few big words to confuse your marker and impress them?
Well, I think your marker will not ever be impressed by massive words or loads of quotations. They just won't, because you can see through it. You're better off, even if you don't properly understand, to try and explain it in your own words.
Shoehorning a skill I should put aside.
And I have had sentences that have been about half a page long, that are so multi-clausal, have got so many commas and semicolons and colons and dashes in them, that I have no idea what the point of the sentence was in the end.
Yeah. And often there will be a really good point in there somewhere waiting to get out, and it's almost clouded and drowning by the other things around it. I do that as well, and sometimes when I'm reading my own work and I've been editing things or I've changed my view on something and I'm going through something quite long-winded, you actually sit back and think, that's not making any sense because I've been changing it. And it's really normal to see how students deliver these sentences, because often there are some really good ideas in there. We've sort of spoken about the, I guess, editing process, and that it's important to identify what the function of each paragraph is and where you're driving your argument, where you're including your evidence, etc. But with your language, if you're not quite sure on things, how might you sort of dissect those ideas so that you can not do that?
Well, I think, first of all, when you're planning your essay, when you're writing down your ideas, what are the ideas around this subject? So what are your points? And just write a sentence. It shouldn't be any more than a sentence, and it shouldn't be a 10-line sentence either. You should be able to express your ideas very simply and concisely. And I mean, this is with everything. Goes with creative writing as well. It comes straight from it. If you can't explain your short story in one sentence, you've had it, really.
Yeah.
And there's something that creative writers call the 25-word challenge. So even novels should be able to be summed up in 25 words. So an essay idea definitely should be.
So even if students have a plan, they then write, they then edit, they think, oh, just add that bit in there, and this is when things can get a little convoluted at times. Are there any tips you've got about distilling these ideas? Do you write, this is the point of this paragraph? Do you highlight things? How do you identify what you're doing and when you're doing it, when you've been going through that process in the right sort of way?
Well, for myself, I will have my idea, and I'll have every single paragraph will have an idea, and that's the bit that I highlight.
Yeah.
And if anything in that sentence isn't either evidence of that idea or contextualising that idea or evaluating that idea or leading on to the next sentence to move on that argument, I bin it. And that includes repetition, because often students will come up with an idea. A burger needs to have meat in it. And then they'll say 2 sentences away, it is all... and in addition, meat is always the best food in a burger. They'll say exactly the same thing in 2 different ways, or 3 or 4 different ways sometimes.
And of course, no one likes fluff in a burger.
No.
So it's important to identify what you're doing, but equally understandable to see how and why those things can happen. Sophie and HJ, how are people getting on with this idea of the essay writing? And are you still talking about food, or are there any other questions we can answer in terms of paragraphing and structuring, and most importantly, planning at this point?
I think planning has been a bit thing. I think Sylvia was saying she finds it a bit difficult planning in terms of organising ideas, because I think, like me, I'll write down a lot of things I want to write about, but then knowing how to put it together and structure it can be a bit of a problem.
I used to write mine on Post-it notes, because then you can reorder them. how you need them to be. So that was always my one good essay
I
tip.
like that.
Not that I write essays anymore, but you can then restructure them sort of in that way. We have also got some questions on word count and how to monitor that as well. I don't know if that's something that you could help
Yeah,
with.
go on. Chuck us some quick questions in on that.
It's just a conversation really on word count. People do struggle with it. How do they stick to the word count? What's the guidelines on the word count? Because it might say, 3,000 words, but, how far over that, how far under that sort of thing. Just general really queries on word count, I think they're struggling with.
I think in arts subjects, I don't know if it's in other subjects, it's always 10%. You've got a 10% leeway, so you can go 10% over your word count. But really, try and stick in the word count because it's a really good skill. And if you find that a struggle, when you come up with your argument for your essay and you come up with your points, actually say, I'm going to write 300 words about that. And that includes the evidence, that includes the point, the evidence, and the contextualisation and everything. You can break it down that simply.
Yeah. Davin, thank you for your tip on Grammarly, which helps with sentence structure, which is a plug, and I'm sure that'd be really useful for people. This is a good question about word count because you're sort of, I guess, going towards this idea about breaking things up when you're planning it and starting to think about them. But word counts, they give students a really good indication of the level of depth that they're expected to go into. So you can't write a 1,500-word essay that is a comprehensive account of everything that's gone on in your module, for example. No. You could if you had 15,000 words, but not 1,500. So these word counts give a good indication, and they are roomy. So whilst some modules might have a 10% leeway, and you should always check whether or not your module does, because there are penalties for exceeding those word counts, they are there to give an idea. And I often find when I'm marking them that the ones that sort of go up to that 10% are often a little bit verbose. They'll often be covering things they don't necessarily need to. There are very few essays that get those extra marks because ultimately there's about a nice 5 or 6 points maybe that you're wanting to make in an essay of about that word count.
Yes, indeed, yes. And often even people who go up to the 10% often haven't answered the question, I find. And the reason they've carried on writing is they sort of know. They haven't answered the question, so they're carrying on and on and on and getting more and more pieces of evidence.
Yeah. So tell us, those of you who've said things about word count, is it something that which is very common, students will start doing that and they'll go, I've got 1,500 words and I'm going to write, and then they write and then they do a word count and they go, right, I've written 300. This is without a plan, which is very, very common. And I think this is why sometimes there is this issue with planning. Is it that issue with word count, or is it about identifying how much you can physically fit in that essay? So let us know in the chat and we'll come back to that. So are you just writing and filling words and then thinking I've got to cut down on all of these? Or is it more an issue of level of depth? And we can try and address that as well. Now, Nikki, we had some other things to cover in terms of, we have some other widgets about how you write a good essay and defining the main parts of an essay. And one of the things that we wanted to really cover was mostly what was in the middle. And then because we disagreed about the introduction being at the middle and the end, we can cover the conclusion, etc. But ultimately, I mean, one needs to have a sense of what one's doing, and however one chooses to segment their ideas about what goes in a paragraph, it's important to be at least to be able to recognise when you have got the evidence and when you have got the evaluation, etc. There was one thing I wanted to ask you about context, because I think this is a very important point that isn't always explained. Tell us what you mean by context, and is this the same thing as giving background information? How do you use context to actually drive an argument as opposed to giving people an idea about maybe the historical elements or something that's sort of what I might call peripheral material? Because this is a very common thing. Students will have read about this in the module and think, oh, that's really important. I shall put that in terms of my context. But I'm sensing that what you're sort of referring to in terms of context is a bit more evaluative. So this matters because of such and such. So the context of this is in this sense. How might students differentiate from that very descriptive to that more evaluative aspect of something that is ultimately putting something in context?
Well, the context is the bed on which your argument lies, really. So it can go in all sorts of directions, but it's probably almost that, really, the context. So I can't write about Student Hub Live without talking about the Open University, without talking about students needing to know about essays, without without the structure of Open University degrees. I couldn't write. That's the context, and it's extremely important.
Yes.
So without,
But we don't have to describe the whole Open University.
no, we don't. But we have to refer to it.
Yes.
Otherwise, we won't know what you're talking
So
about.
it's about having the confidence, I guess, to know when you need to describe things and know when you need to mention them to sort of put them in that context, isn't it?
Yes. And again, as you were talking about word count before, the length, your word count will tell you how much context you need.
Yeah.
So in a thing, well, what is the point of Student Hub Live on essay writing? If that was your question, you don't need to write about the history of the Open University from Harold Wilson to
No.
2017.
We would need cake.
Well,
for
we
that.
did. I need wine, never mind cake. So, but what you do need to just put, you need to put. There's been a lot of questions from students about essay writing and in the Open University, and then
Okay, so there's lots of different formats that people can work with. Georgina and Matt mentioned the PEE, point evidence evaluation. We've got PESTLE structures. There are all these various sorts of things that people can use to think about structuring a paragraph in the same way as they might do with a burger. And all of those will have some sort of evidence within them, and some might be longer or shorter than others. Now, it can be quite a useful technique to start thinking about those and actually trying to write them. Because when you do start trying to write them, you realise the bit you really want to write about, the evidence, is often a very small part of that paragraph. How do you advise students to maybe work with some of those tools to actually develop their writing, even if they don't want to have a formulaic sort of table type approach to writing an essay? They can be a useful exercise to develop writing skills.
they can. And I think point evidence evaluation, I think, is a thing it's taught in school. And I always think that's one of the most useful things because it's easy to remember. And you can actually use it without even opening a book sometimes. You've done your course, and especially at this time of the year when you're looking at your end of module assessment, you've done your course and you've got your question and you think, what is the point here? What do I know? What do I know? What was that evidence? You don't have to, you can open the book later in a way and find it, but start writing what you know already. And I often think that's an easier way to start to write an essay than to go to the books and get all your quotations and all your paraphrasing, because that's when you get swamped.
It is, isn't it? And you lose sense of that clarity, which is ultimately what these EMAs are about. Right, let's talk about introductions and conclusions as well. And the other point I wanted to pick up on was this idea of language, which is often coming through in an introduction where people will start fluctuating between the third and first person. I'm going to tell you this, blah, blah, and blah. Now, depending on what sort of format, there might be conventions around that, but traditionally it's normally in the third person. We like objective academic language,
We do.
and we like to be more assertive, not only to cut down on words. So we've asked people what the introduction will do. Here are some examples. Again, I'm not sure what I choose here. I don't know whether this is a trick question. We've got tells the reader what you will say, puts issues in context, defines key terms, and provides background information. Now, this is a multi-choice question, so which do you think is the most important one when you're planning your essays? Let's see what people had to say about that. Okay, most of them about telling the reader what you will say, so 84% there. Background information as well as important, and also putting the issue in context. Defines key terms. Oh, I would disagree with this one because I think defining key terms is really important. But sometimes it can feel really simplistic, especially when you're doing something more holistic. You think, I don't want to tell you what inequality is about. I don't want to talk about making and remaking, to go back to Matt's DD 102 essay question. So what should you be putting in this introduction, and how might it all sort of hang together?
Well, again, the defining key terms is about context, because lettuce in the context of our discussion this morning isn't lettuce, is it? It's an analogy for something. And in your essay, the words that you use, the main question words, that you have to contextualise them in that first paragraph, because otherwise anybody reading it doesn't know what you're going to be talking about, because things mean different things in different circumstances.
But everyone is right in terms of that the introduction must tell the reader what you're going to say. They need a clear idea about what you're going to be delivering and how you're going to address that question, don't they? But some students will say, You've asked me to talk about making and remaking an inequality, and in this essay I will be telling you about making and remaking inequality using 2 out of 3 strands. And they might repeat the question because they think that that's telling the reader what they're doing. What's your advice on that as a strategy?
Well, don't repeat the question, but often you will rephrase the question. So often you will kind of mix it, especially at level 1, you will kind of sort of turn it on its head a bit. But basically you are saying that this is what I'm going to be talking about, this is what I'm going to prove. But you will introduce in your introduction your central argument.
Okay. So that is ultimately where you're going with the essay. Yeah. And we spoke before about how, irrespective of what the question was, you would normally have some sort of approach that had some sort of argument, even if it was a descriptive essay or one that wasn't necessarily asking for that. You might be arguing that there's more of this than that, and it matters because of this. So however you choose to carve it up, you will have some sort of main idea that you're wanting to progress, some sort of theme, I guess, that hangs it all together, isn't it?
Yes, you will. And you just introduce it in that introduction that you're going to be talking about this, and you might even refer to some of your sources and why you're going to be looking at X, Y, and Z in order to show this.
Is there? We've talked about these PESEL and PEE structures for paragraphs. Is there a structure for introductions, or is there a way of doing it? I've seen these various sort of triangular diagrams and things. Are those helpful tools for students to start thinking about in terms of what they could include?
Yes, like the funnel idea. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yes. Where you have, you're feeding a lot of things in, and what's coming out is going to be a smaller amount.
Yes.
So you're chucking, a bit like a food processor, you're chucking it all in and then coming through. So I think it is. I think it is, yeah.
And when you talk about context, I mean, how important is context? You know, some students will start an essay with something mind-blowing that's really broad, and you think, wow, that's incredible. But it's not really the question that we're sort of answering at the moment. How high up can you go with this sort of various funnel idea in terms of broad? I mean, you mentioned context in terms of the lettuce here. We're not talking about sweet food, we're only talking about savoury food for today. So how important is that context, and where do you start?
I think it's very important indeed. And really, you want to start with your context. You want to start with that. And so it is in the context of the essay, lettuce will be shown to, is being discussed in this way. Yes. I can't remember, what did we say lettuce was?
So in our introduction, if this was our essay, what might we say? We're saying essay writing is really important to students, and what's really important is combining a variety of things within an essay and within paragraphs. Yeah. So what might we then say? So that's our broad, I guess, part of the introduction.
Yes, so we're going to combine it in order to show how to write a good essay, one that will achieve some good marks. Yeah. And in doing this, we're going to show how burgers or whatever can provide a good evidence. Yeah. And we might actually even list all these ingredients. Yeah. And then we will go on paragraph by paragraph to look at the different ingredients.
Yes. And then we'll say, finally, we will discuss the importance of introductions and conclusions to framing this essay and argue that one should really have a planned approach to writing a good essay. So that's our argument, really, is you need to plan it and you need to get the right mix in. That's really what we're trying to say. So that might make a good introduction then to our essay, which we knew at the start. So I can see where you think we should be sort of writing these introductions at the start. So we knew all of that, but equally maybe we weren't quite sure on how important some of those points were. So irrespective of whether students write the introduction at the start or the end, there needs to be the sense checking, I guess, of whether what they're saying is delivering on what is in there. Because sometimes, best will in the world, you think, I am answering this question, and you can see it. You can see in utmost clarity. And then they seem to go off and play tennis or something and come back and then write something entirely different. So it's important that they sort of mirror each other, isn't it, in terms of delivering on the promises?
Yes, it is, and that's exactly what it is. An introduction is your promise of what you're going to give. So you would start this particular essay that you would start by you need to make a point in each paragraph. Yeah. And you would start by defining what a point is. Yeah. And you would start how would you talk about each point?
Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So the introduction can see how that would work. Let's think about some conclusions, because these are often very, very challenging, and I actually think are very difficult to write well.
Yes.
You can obviously write a conclusion by telling people what you've done. Let's see what everyone says in terms of the multi-choice question where we asked you about conclusions. Do they tell the reader what you said, explain how you've answered the question, indicate new lines of inquiry, or include new evidence? So what do you think is most important in a conclusion? Let's see. Okay, so explains how you've answered the question with 69%. That is excellent. I'm very glad to see no new evidence there, because that's a big no-no, isn't it, Nikki?
It is, but it's often brought in, and often that you'll come and there'll be a brand new argument.
Yeah.
Like 2 lines from the end, and you'll think, if you'd put that higher up, that would have been great, but not here, not here.
Yeah.
It's a summary of all your points and how you've answered the question. Yeah.
Okay, so if we were writing a conclusion then to this, we could on one hand say, we've decided to talk about essay writing, we've used some burger analogies to show you how you might do this and this and this. We could tell them what we've done. But another way, and I guess a more sophisticated way of doing it, is to sort of say why what we've done is answering the question.
Yeah.
So I guess really our argument was that sometimes you can get muddled with the words, and it's nice to have a visual picture.
Yes.
So if we've given you a visual picture about how you might want to do this, you could apply this using highlighters or however you might want to sort of deconstruct your essay and your paragraphs.
Yes.
And we've used this because visualisation and being able to recognise a mixture of things is really important in getting that right balance.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas a lot of people might say we've done X, Y and Z and those things are important, this is more about why we've done this, why we've included this and how we think that this is met the brief in terms of what we were trying to do in the first place.
Yes, and it is ultimately answering the question. So you have a question, you have your introduction suggesting how this is going to be answered, then you answer it using a variety of points and context and evidence and evaluation, and then you conclude it by saying why this was all relevant to and how you
Now, Georgina and Matt were talking about using feedback because, of course, one thing students have been doing often is writing a lot of essays and getting feedback on those as well. But what we did say was that sometimes we can feel very close to them, in particular when we get our feedback and we may feel very misunderstood and we might think that the sheer points of genius were just missed. But, which they can be, but sometimes it's a good idea to go back and think about what you're doing well and being a bit more objective about it. So what would your advice be in terms of going back to the things that you have already been doing and maybe thinking about this approach? How could people then start going, what was I doing in this essay and did that make sense in terms of that question? Could they use any of these tools?
I think they could, and I think that just those labels of context, of evidence, of evaluation, have a look at your essays and have a look, where are you using these? Have a look, where are you using evidence? Have you contextualised it? Are you evaluating it? Are you linking paragraphs together? Are you doing this? What is your tutor saying to you all the way through? And again, if your tutor says things that you don't understand, ask them. Because also, or even if you don't agree with them, sometimes tutors can miss things, but generally a tutor is happy to explain why they've said something.
Now, Sylvia needs a cure for disjointed paragraphs, which are a very, very challenging thing. We talk about linking words, and we haven't done that so much today, and we're nearly out of time. But sometimes when you are planning these things and they are hanging together very well, we need to link things together. We can do that through either restructuring or perhaps adding some context or framing things.
Yeah.
But when paragraphs are disjointed, it can really jar an argument. So what would your advice be in terms of techniques that Sylvia might be able to use to link things up and marry them?
Well, if going back to our burgers again, we were talking about layers earlier, and perhaps in this particular essay, we would use the word layer in each paragraph. So in the second layer, and you could use something that will just link it back to something that you've said previously. Try and use a word that will come back to the previous paragraph.
That's good advice. Well, I hope we've answered that question. And Jordan, I like your do-re-mi idea. I think that's a very good place to start, as long as you have a plan, of course. Let's take a quick trip to the hot desk and Sophie and HJ, see if there are any other last-minute questions before we wrap up this morning's live session.
I think, well, one of the things Sylvia was saying, as Jordan said, about whether we start at the introduction or not, I'm struggling with this because I'm not tended to at the moment. But we did have some different views as to this word count issue that we talked about. So Jordan always has to cut down. Clara has problems of sort of going on and trying to actually put down what she says concisely, maybe a bit of an issue, so she makes long points. Colin has some great advice about breaking the essay down into chunks and being really detailed about what you're going to write as in order to help the word count. And
So does Stephanie on that point, actually. She assigns word counts to paragraphs. So as a mathematician, I like that. Like the breakdown of numbers. So she then has even if it's just a rough idea for each paragraph, and that helps her overall word count then.
And Chantal's talking about level of detail again. I think that's always a bit of a tricky one to try and get.
I think on that, the question about concision there and having big, long, verbose points, one of the things that I think is a really good tip is try and explain your point to somebody else, just verbally. Just try and explain it. And if you don't really understand it, you will be whittering on for hours. But you should be able to explain it in a sentence.
Yes. So a good idea then to maybe go to a friend who doesn't know anything ideally about what you're trying to do and say, well, I'm writing about this. And the answer would not be, well, I'm talking about Veblen then.
Yeah.
You know, because if you don't know what it is you're talking about, then it's very unlikely that you have a point there to sort of back it up with. But I guess really, you know, one of the take-home tips I would have with a lot of this is that the planning and the balance is so much more important than the writing process, that you get so messed up when you over-edit and when you're writing, you know, too many things and adding points in. If you've got a clarity about what you're trying to do at the start, it can give you a lot of an easier ride, although of course everyone is so different with the way they prefer to work. Some people love editing and over-editing, whereas I often find that for me I'll lose the points because I try and cram so much in that I then end up with a very diluted paragraph.
Yes, and really, you're better with fewer pieces of evidence that are well explained, well contextualised, that are supported with. You're better off with fewer than too many, because too many, you're not going to be explaining your arguments very well at all, and the reader's just going to feel overwhelmed with stuff, aren't they? With burger.
Not a good thing. Well, thank you so much, Nikki Harlow, for coming along today and giving us your guide. I hope that that's given you some tips and ideas about how you might look at things, so in terms of planning things and also in terms of identifying when you've written your essay, what bits are doing what and whether they're working for you. And Davin, thank you so much. You're always so helpful. You've got some lovely links to some of the MOOCs on FutureLearn and OpenLearn for study skills that people can go and find out more. So that's a good way of doing things also, as long as you're not procrastinating too much, isn't it, HJ?
What?
Typical. Right, Sophie and HJ, just some final words from you, and how helpful have people found this sort of space to start thinking about essay writing? It is a very difficult thing. You are learning it. You know, we hope never to be masters at it. We hope to always improve at it. So I hope it's been useful for you. But any last words from you two?
Yeah, everyone seems to have been really helpful, and it's nice to see that everyone's now chatting along to each other, which is great. As Davin said, there is FutureLearn and OpenLearn. We also have Catch Up and our YouTube channel, so there are lots of sessions on there. So if you've got any other questions, do go and have a look at that. Again, you can email us, studenthub@open.ac.uk, if you have any specific questions. But it's really nice to see everyone getting along in the chat. So it's
we've
been a
had
lovely
some
session.
good conversations about word counts and different tips, which I always find fantastic. Libby has a great one. She called P, which is point, evidence, explain, and evaluation, which I think is a nice sort of thing to sort of keep in mind. So I'm going to be sticking that on my board. And I really do like Sophie's point about using like post-it notes for outlines. I think that's very helpful. But yeah, I think we're all very happy, and we've got some great advice. So
considering all the burger talk, we've done well to stay on point today. We've done really well.
Stay focused, not
There's
too
less
much.
procrastination in the chat than there is.
So we don't need to get that video out.
I knew that savoury food was going to be a real winner. I really did think that would make the tone a little bit more sensible. So well done. Although peeing essays, I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, it's a good tool to use. So thank you for that, Libby. Excellent. Well, been a really, really great morning. We're going to go and have some food now for an hour, but we're going to keep the chat room open. And while we're having some food, we're going to play you some of our favourite sessions. We're going to look at referencing from the library, because nothing would be complete without a little touch on referencing after a bit of talk about essay writing. And then we're going to play a careers session, which is about mindfulness and careers, because this afternoon we've got a jam-packed 2 hours of further activity to start thinking about your OU journey. So we're going to do a little bit of problem solving and get some nice headspace to start thinking about what you want and how you can get it. We're also going to look at some great apps that you can use to think about your qualifications and whether they're right for you, and again linking those through to employability. And then at 2:30 we have a sneak preview, because next week on the 3rd of May we have a Brexit discussion from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and we're going to have a discussion for half an hour about identity and citizenship. I'm really looking forward to that. So we will see you live at 1, but the chat room will be open. Enjoy the videos, keep talking to each other, and email us any questions that you've got. And in fact, if you'd like to send us a selfie, we can probably get something printed out in the lunch break as well. So that's studenthub@open.ac.uk or hashtag StudentHubLive16. Show us where you're at today and what you're having for your lunch. We'll see you very soon.